Hello and welcome to this rather special edition of 7 Days in Europe. As you can see, we're not actually in a studio, we're out and about, but still inside the European Parliament. Well, it's been quite a busy week here. We had Mario Draghi, the President of the European Central Bank, telling the Economic Affairs Committee that he sees signs of a possible upturn, a bit of a recovery in the second half of next year, so good news for a change. MEPs failed to reach agreement with the Commission and the Member State governments on a policy on asylum, and that's what we're going to be talking about in a moment. But they have now also started what's called a trilogue amongst the institutions on sorting out something to help the seasonal workers, the people who come to Europe to work for agriculture, horticulture, the tourism industry and so on. My guest today is British Socialist Claude Morris. Welcome, Claude. Thanks for coming along here. And very soon we'll be talking about these issues. But first of all, we have to go to the yes-no interlude, in which I will be asking you a series of questions to which I'd like you to answer just yes or no. Okay, here we go. Claude, is the EU asking people to take too much pain along with the recovery?
Perhaps.
Do you share Mario Draghi's optimistic view of next year?
Yes, I do.
The most recent summit didn't make an awful lot of progress. Are you worried about that?
No.
Is the present state of Europe, do you fear, encouraging nationalism?
Yes.
Is populism a fear? And is it, I was going to say, is it the politicians who are to blame?
They share in it, yes.
Okay. Should the EU be doing more about the rise of the far right, do you think?
Absolutely.
Is there something that can be done about the rise of the far right?
We can do something about it, yes.
The Arab Spring showed Europe to be very disunited over asylum. Has much changed since then?
We should have taken more advantage of the Arab Spring in a positive direction.
Are you worried that the first political victim was agreement on the Schengen Treaty?
Yes.
Okay, Claude, we've run right out of time on the yes-no interlude, so thank you very much indeed for taking part.
It's a pleasure.
Now, in a moment, we'll be taking a look at what the news has been this week. But first of all, can I just ask you, problems still remain, it seems, on the asylum policy. We were hoping for an agreement among the institutions. It didn't happen. What do you see as the main obstacles?
I think on asylum policy, Jim, we have a package, an asylum package, which is all essentially about burden sharing. It was an intricate package which included security elements like the Eurodac package, which is about asylum fingerprinting, but it was also about other elements, about procedures and so on. And this is very difficult to interpret by people outside this place. But together, what it does is it creates something to do with burden sharing between member states and a kind of common asylum system. And what's been problematic is to get all the member states to agree on this package. Okay,
Claude, we'll come back to talk about this and other elements connected with it. You mentioned Eurodac there in just a moment. But first, let's take a quick look at the week's news with Caroline Grasso.
48 heures après le sommet européen, débriefing ce lundi au Parlement. Vendredi dernier, les 27 se sont finalement mis d'accord sur un système de supervision bancaire unique. Les pouvoirs de contrôle de la Banque centrale européenne sont renforcés. Objectif, améliorer la prévention des crises. Mais l'avenir de la zone euro n'est pas réglé, ont de nouveau insisté les eurodéputés. Problème, les 27 ont renvoyé à plus tard la question de la nouvelle gouvernance de l'eurozone. Le président de la Banque centrale européenne, Mario Draghi, était aussi au Parlement lundi pour rencontrer les députés de la Commission économique. L'occasion de discuter du nouveau mécanisme de supervision des banques, mais aussi de l'avenir de la zone euro. Le dernier dialogue monétaire s'est achevé sur une note malgré tout encourageante.
We expect economic weakness to extend into the next year, with a very gradual recovery in the second half of the year.
Un cœur pour la paix et la démocratie en Europe. Un gigantesque néon a été installé sur la façade du Parlement lundi à Bruxelles. Un hommage à Václav Havel, disparu il y a un an. Havel a été le dernier président de la Tchécoslovaquie, puis le premier de la République tchèque après la révolution de velours de 1989. Figure emblématique des changements politiques des anciens pays communistes, son action a culminé avec l'intégration de 10 nouveaux États membres dans l'Union européenne. C'était en 2004.
Claude, let's go back to this asylum issue for a moment. I know it's very close to your heart. The electorates generally seem to be pretty unsympathetic towards migrants. Whose fault is that? Is it the media? Is it politicians to a certain extent?
I think the issue of immigration and asylum goes to the very core of people's feelings. There's a human reaction against the other. People coming from third countries, that's a human, historic reaction. So that's a settled thing, that's a historic thing. But secondly, there's an economic reaction. We have a period of austerity. So people, know that we need migrants, people who come here, who take very often the jobs that nobody wants to do.
Though? Do they actually know that well enough? Because Europe's built on migration.
Europe's built on migration. People see migrants doing the jobs that many other people don't want to do. People increasingly see migrants doing the jobs that are very high skilled, that we can't fill. Yet there is a kind of denial going on, and this is what we call a visceral reaction, a reaction to people because we have a fear of the other. And this is now being built upon because we have austerity. And in times of austerity, there's a reaction because people feel there's a cake and we don't want to divide that cake any further. So austerity is making this reaction even stronger. And that's why, for example, I'm in charge of a seasonal workers directive where we had the trialogue this very week. And you see the council, the member states, reacting very badly to it. And they're reacting badly to it not because we don't need it, we need protections for seasonal workers. They're coming in the same numbers they have always come in because we need seasonal work. We need people to do that kind of work and we need them to be protected in that work. But there is a reaction against them because people, citizens, feel more insecure in times of austerity.
One of the objections to any sort of deal for the temporary workers, the people who came in the summer and so on, was from the trades union movement, of course, because they were afraid that it would help unscrupulous employers to depress wages.
Sure. In fact, in this trialogue, you've seen that the trade unions are now very happy with the Seasonal Workers Directive because there are all the protections for seasonal workers, but the sectors are very well defined. So you have seasonal work, horticulture, work which is genuinely seasonal, but you don't have work like construction, for example, which is not dependent on the seasons. Therefore, the unions are very happy with this. The protections are there for seasonal workers who were previously exploited. So, we're saying to the member states, look, this is a good piece of work, but you still have that thing about immigration for which there's a reaction, particularly in times of austerity. But we're saying, look, it's very important in a European Union where there's free movement, where immigration is going to continue, even in times of austerity, that you have protections in place for high-skilled workers. So we have the ICT, the Intercorporate Transfer Directive, but also for lower-skilled workers, you have the Seasonal Workers Directive. Why do you need these protections? Because you don't want these scenes like we had in Rosarno in Italy, where people are living in the forest, because that's bad for everyone to have these kinds of debased standards. It's good for Europe to have seasonal work which is well regulated, because we're always going to need that kind of work, even in these times of austerity.
We've got very little time left, I'm afraid, Claude, but I just wanted to ask you briefly about PNR, because that, again, agreement on that has been put off, and I gather it's because different groups haven't actually reached agreement within themselves on this. Is it an issue for you, do you think?
I think this passenger name records, again, is all about data and how we track terrorists. And one of the big issues here, Jim, is that we have that, but we also have this big data protection directive coming, this huge juggernaut of a piece of legislation coming in January. And I think Viviane Reding talked about, putting the cart before the horse and the horse before the cart. And what it's all about is we need to have probably one overarching data protection directive which deals with all sorts of data for all sorts of purposes. And PNR was to do with anti-terrorism and using it for that. So that's what the big issue is at the moment, and getting that right.
Claude Morris, thanks very much indeed. I'll say goodbye to you and wish you the compliments of the season.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Claude. You're watching 7 Days in Europe. Well, the recent climate talks, the UN climate talks in Doha, were either a disappointing anticlimax or an important step on the road to 2015 and a bigger deal, depending on whose version you believe. 194 countries represented there. They didn't seem to achieve very much, but they did extend the protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, that is, for another 8 years, which is something. And Commissioner Connie Hedegaard put a very positive spin on the whole thing. Well, to discuss it with me in just a moment, I have Dutch Green Bas Eickhout, who was actually there. But just before we start talking about that, we need to have our yes-no interlude, in which for 1 minute I'll ask a series of questions, which I'd like you to answer, please. Yes or no? Have the recent extreme weather events focused people's minds more on climate change?
Yes.
There are still doubters, though, even among senior politicians. Is that a worry?
Yes.
I mean, the science is definitely there, isn't it, to prove it?
Yes.
Much money, though, is invested in the fossil fuel industry. They seem to have the biggest clout when it comes to advertising and lobbying.
Unfortunately, yes.
There's much debate, particularly in Europe now, about fracking. The US claims it's the way forward for them. Should we be exploring it?
No.
Do you feel that it is a dangerous technology?
Yes.
There's still no smart grid in Europe, and that's something which there seems to be no political will for. Is that true?
No, there is will.
But we do need it, do we not, to have the renewables usable across the whole continent?
Absolutely.
Many people are worried too about the idea of a lot of wind farms springing up all over the place. Does that concern you that they meet opposition?
Yes.
Okay, we've run out of time, I'm afraid, so thank you very much indeed, Bas Eickhout, for taking part in that. Now, just before we move on, we have a short report, not actually on anything to do with Doha, it's to do with air pollution, but we'll come to that in a moment. You were actually there. Would you hail it as a success or a total failure?
Neither the two, I would say. So that's usually a political answer, right, in the middle. No, it's absolutely not a success. If you look at what we need for climate change, then the pace is far too slow. But to say it's a complete failure is also not recognizing that some small steps have been taken. So it's neither the two. There have been taken some steps, but it's really marginal.
Okay, well, we'll be coming back to Doha in just a moment. But first of all, we do have this report on, well, it's to do with the environment, it's not to do with Doha. It's air pollution in the city of Paris. And to report on it, here's Hugh Weinstock.
Il faut prendre de la hauteur pour se rendre compte du phénomène et observer la couche de pollution atmosphérique flotter au-dessus de la ville de Paris. Plus de 70 stations de mesure comme celle-ci sont disséminées aux quatre coins de la ville. Elles mesurent la pollution présente dans l'air.
Sur une station comme celle-ci, en moyenne annuelle, on est à près de 70 microgrammes par mètre cube pour le dioxyde d'azote, là où la réglementation n'en autorise que 40.
Quant aux particules fines émises par les moteurs diesel, ce filtre blanc les piège. Voici à quoi il ressemble après une journée passée à proximité de la circulation automobile. Il est complètement noir. La France est poursuivie devant la Cour de justice européenne à cause de concentrations trop élevées de particules fines dans l'air dans certaines de ces villes. Une véritable bombe à retardement sanitaire, comme nous le confirme ce médecin impliqué dans la lutte contre les maladies respiratoires.
La bombe a déjà explosé. On sait que ce sont des facteurs d'augmentation d'un certain nombre de maladies respiratoires, comme les bronchopathies chroniques obstructives, les maladies asthmatiques et, pour les particules, probablement le cancer du poumon.
Le trafic routier est responsable d'une partie importante, c'est la première source de pollution pour l'Île-de-France, avec plus de la moitié des rejets d'oxyde d'azote liés au trafic routier, mais également des sources de particules, à peu près un tiers en termes de rejets directs pour les particules liées au trafic routier.
Le maire de Paris a souhaité prendre les devants en la matière. Il a dévoilé son plan pour améliorer la qualité de l'air en Île-de-France. Parmi les mesures proposées, l'interdiction à la circulation des véhicules anciens dans le centre-ville et la proche banlieue, et la réduction de 10 km/h de la vitesse maximale autorisée sur le périphérique. Retour à notre station de mesure au cœur de Paris, où l'on comprend mieux que la problématique de la pollution atmosphérique doit aussi se voir à l'échelle européenne. La raison en est simple, la pollution ne s'arrête pas aux frontières des États.
Concrètement, d'un jour à l'autre, on peut voir des niveaux de particules qui varient considérablement du fait de masses d'air qui nous proviennent du nord ou de l'est de l'Europe, donc déjà chargées de pollution. C'est que sur une station comme celle où on se trouve là près du trafic routier, on pouvait avoir jusqu'à 40% des particules mesurées qui provenaient d'imports d'autres régions, voire d'autres pays.
Les dernières études montrent qu'à Paris, la pollution atmosphérique diminue l'espérance de vie de ses habitants de plus de 6 mois et génère des coûts de soins de santé de plusieurs millions d'euros par an.
That report then from Hugh Weinstock. Do you feel that some of the momentum for dealing with climate change has been lost? Because we've been talking about it for a long time. We're still 8 years away from 2020.
We talk about it a long time indeed. Whether we are really acting on it, that is another discussion, of course. But you're absolutely right. We lost a bit of the momentum. I think after 2009, where everyone is expecting now the real step is going to be taken in Copenhagen, the famous Copenhagen summit, that was a total failure. That was a big disappointment. And at the same time, there was this debate on science. Was science sound enough, and etc. So that combination, and then on top of it, the economic crisis indeed lowered the attention of climate. But I do think if you now look on new developments, I do have the feeling that the climate issue is slowly getting back on the agenda again, but slowly.
What was the atmosphere like in Doha? Because we hear that it was extended, of course, and that the people who were chairing it really didn't have any idea of the issues concerned, and that this spoiled things somewhat.
Well, always the chair of such a meeting is very important, and this time it was Qatar. It's an oil and gas country, so right out from the beginning, you knew that they are not the ones really pushing for it. But I think the bigger problem was that there was no really clear deadline for issues to be taken care of. So if you don't have a deadline, and politicians, you don't give them a deadline, they're not moving. That's always the problem with politicians. They need a deadline. They really need some very clear agenda items which they need to discuss. And I think that was a problem, that it wasn't really clear on what do we need to deliver in Doha to really make progress. And that was the problem.
There still seems to be a lack of commitment on the part of the United States, despite Obama's re-election.
That's absolutely obvious. I mean, everyone is expecting a lot from Obama, but in the end, he needs to get a majority in the Senate. And there is a huge problem in getting a majority in the Senate to agree to an international binding regulation. I don't think America will be ever a first mover on this one. So I also think therefore Europe should shift away a bit the focus away from the US and more looking at the East. In China, India, a lot more things are happening there. And I think if we get things moving there, then in the end the US will move. But don't start with the US, because they are way too much looking into internal things.
I mean, China is tackling climate change, I know, but the actual issue of carbon tons of carbon per head of population is still actually on the rise there. That's such a huge population. I mean, that must be a concern, because they still have to go through a lot of the evolution, if you like, the industrial evolution that we've already had in the West.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm not saying that China is doing it all perfectly, absolutely not. But what you see happening is that from their perspective, for example, air pollution, it is really becoming a big issue in Chinese cities. So the debate on coal-fired power plants is becoming a big issue in China as well. And at this stage, they are one of the biggest investors in solar energy, in wind energy. So they are really investing in everything, more or less. And that is, of course, interesting to see whether we can push them a bit more to the renewable side and get away from the coal-fired power plants. And I think that is a kind of a crucial development that is ongoing in China, and that is something that is very, well, we need to watch it very closely.
And Connie Hedegaard said that she was quite pleased by it. She thought we were heading towards 2015 with a better platform, and people are actually, we've got a proper negotiating platform now. Is this rather putting a bit of gloss on something that's not very glossy?
Well, in the end, she agreed with it. So she has to say that it's something. I mean, if you agree in Doha and come back home and say, well, that was nothing, then of course it's also a bit of a strange face. So I understand that she is telling this as a progress, but I must say, in Doha, and the only thing you achieved is a clean process towards 2015, whereas we know we need to act now, it is a bit of a modest and low result. But clearly she can only be positive because she agreed with it. Because
we are in, as you mentioned yourself, in tough economic times at the moment. People are generally more concerned about keeping their jobs, keeping their homes, than they are about whether we're generating clean enough energy. Is that still a problem, to overcome this sort of public apathy, if you like, forced on the public by circumstance?
Yeah, that's really one of the problems, and it's really surprising to me, because if you know what are the future crises, we are looking at the euro crisis right now, but we know in the future it's resource scarcity. The entire world is going into all kind of resources, energy, land, water. All these issues, they become very dominant later on. So if we are now thinking of an investment agenda to get out of this euro crisis, I mean, it's very clearly that you need to have a green investment agenda to create green jobs to get out of this euro crisis and prevent the next crisis, which is a climate and resource crisis. And I think still a lot of politicians, they see it like, oh, we do first economics and then later on environment. That is really one of the most important misconceptions of politicians. You need to tackle them both together, and that is really the only way to get out of all the crises we are envisaging now.
As I go, we've run out of time, I'm afraid. Thanks very much indeed for that. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.